Sylvia Schaefer, and I love it when my quilts disintegrate. Not at the seams, of course. I mean in the design. Using disintegration or deconstruction in your quilt designs is a great way to impart a lot of motion and movement to your quilt designs, and I'd like to talk to you about a couple of different ways that you can achieve that. The first and possibly easiest way is to just take a simple block, such as a half-square triangle, and repeat it in a gradient across your quilt, which is what I've done on this quilt here and on the black and gray quilt behind me as well. I've concentrated my half-square triangles in one particular area, and then as we move across the quilt, there are fewer and fewer of them as we move across, and that creates an effect of disintegration. The other way of doing this is to take a complex block and basically pull it apart. This quilt here is an example of what I mean by a complex block. You can see that there are repeated triangle elements in it. And if you look at the white quilt behind me, you'll see that I used the exact same block as in this red quilt, but I started to pull out some of those triangle elements and have them move away from the precision piece part of the design. The way I made that quilt was to use a combination of paper piecing and improv piecing. And I'd like to show you how to do that using a simplified version of the quilt block. So this is a simplified version of that quilt block. Again, we have repeated triangles, and I'm going to show you how to make that. So I started by creating some paper pieced segments. I'm not going to go into the details of how to paper piece because it's been covered on this show before, but it's a great way to get real precision piecing. So I've made several segments like that. I'm just going to lay them out here. So that's going to be the bottom part of my block, and then in the top part I want to improv piece. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've partially paper pieced a couple of my segments. I stopped after one or two triangles, and then the rest of it is where we're going to improv piece. Now to do that, I'm going to take my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm going to go ahead and just make the first cut. If I want to place my next triangles exactly, what I've done is I've pre-cut some triangles. They are the exact same size as the triangles in the paper piecing. I've just added my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I made myself some little templates to be able to cut those just precisely. So here's my middle-sized triangle. And I can kind of place it wherever I like here on this, just to kind of get an idea of where I'm going to put it. So that looks good to me. I'm going to keep in mind that there's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to cut just a little bit above where I want that triangle, and I'm going to remove the triangle because I don't want to cut through it. And now I'm just going to cut right through my paper pattern because I'm done with that. I'm going to improv piece, and I don't need it anymore. All right, so I can get rid of that. I can, if I want to, go ahead and remove the excess paper from the back. And now I'm ready to go to the machine and sew on my first triangle. I've got my machine set up with just a 1/4 inch foot with a guide at the side to make sure that my seam is really precise. And I'm just going to start sewing here with my 1/4 inch seam. And I have my stitch length set to normal. If you know paper piecing, you know we often drop our stitch length, but I'm done with the paper piecing, so a normal stitch length is fine, just in case I have to unsew. And now I'm going to press this. I like to use a fabric smoothing spray, so I'm just going to spray that. I'm going to press my seam, and then I'm just going to spray again and press that triangle outwards. Now what I need to do is I'll need to cut off these extra points here because I'm going to add the background pieces next. So I'm just going to line my ruler up with my triangle. Remember that triangles are cut to the exact size that they need to be. And so I'm just going to line it up and trim off those little blue dog ears. And now I'm going to go back to the machine and I'm going to add my other two background pieces. All right, so I'm back at the machine here and I'm just going to line up my background piece. Notice that it's plenty large. I'm just going to line it up with that corner. I've cut it to a right angle, so that will make things a little easier for me. If you haven't done that, you can of course just trim it after you've added this on. All right, so there's my first background piece. And you can either go to the iron, or I like to, when I'm paper piecing, just to use my finger to press it. Just kind of run your fingernail along there. And then you can go ahead and just add your next piece right away without bothering to get up and go to the iron every time. So now I'm adding my next background piece. And again, I'm just sewing with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and because my triangle's already the correct size, that should be just perfect. And it will be the exact same size as the triangles in the paper piece pattern. Okay, so now I've added my two background pieces, and I'm going to press these. And I'm going to, again, just spray with my smoothing spray. Press that to set the seam, and then I can press outwards. So now I've added my first improv triangle. And what I do like to do once I've done that is go ahead and trim my wedge just to make sure that I'm really staying within that wedge shape. So I have this ruler, which I like to use. It's a 45-degree ruler, and it shows the seam allowance here, so that helps me kind of see where my seam allowance is going to be. I'm going to trim these two edges, and then I'll be ready for my next triangle. Now, you'll see that there's one segment that I haven't started here, and that one is a segment that I've done using all improv piecing. In order to do all improv piecing, I've started by taking one of my small triangles and adding background on all three sides. There's plenty of background again, and then I can go ahead and use my 45-degree ruler to trim that. Again, I want to make sure that I'm not getting into those 1/4 inch seams, so that's why I like this ruler. If you don't have a ruler like this, you could always just trace the paper piecing pattern outline onto a piece of template plastic, and that will work well too. So I would just trim this. And then that's the start of my first all improv wedge. I can go ahead and then add my triangles to that, just in the way I showed you before. Now, once they're all done, they'll look like this. And so at that point, I can just sew them together to quarters and then halves and then the whole, and I'll have this great improv pieced and paper pieced block. The unifying part of this, of course, is always the triangles. They're always the same size. I just add more background fabric where it's disintegrating. So let's take one final look at the finished quilt using this technique. You can also think about disintegration in your quilting designs. And on that quilt, I also incorporated that concept using things like disintegrating feathers and circles and other designs to help bring the whole quilt together. So that's how you use disintegration or deconstruction in your quilt designs. I hope you'll try it because it's one of my favorite techniques.